Hello everyone, I'm Tsula, host of Tsula's Big Adventures, and this is my multi-part series, Tsula's Complete Video Guide to Becoming an Amateur Astronomer. Chapter 7, Telescope Buying Guide. So, you want to buy a telescope? Okay, let's get started. Google search, telescope for sale. 180 million results. Oh my goodness, whoa, that's a lot of choices. Oh dear, now what? Deciding what telescope to buy by searching for telescopes for sale on Google is not a good idea, and I don't recommend it. Instead, let's approach it methodically. You need to ask yourself some questions and give some very honest answers. And you need to think about the things we talked about in Chapter 2 under Getting Started. What's your living situation? Are you like most people and you live under urban or suburban skies that are heavily light polluted? You're probably going to want to take your equipment to a darker place. So, what's your commitment level with that? Are you willing to take a telescope and put it in your car? Does it fit in your car? Drive it somewhere, set it up, take it back down at the end of the night, take it back home? How heavy of a telescope can you handle now and 10, 20 years from now? Will you still be able to lift that telescope then? What are your goals? Are you only interested in astrophotography? That will impact what kind of telescope you buy. Are you only interested in visual? Well, that'll impact what you get. Or you want to do a little of both. Is your significant other on board with you going out with the telescope to remote locations? Is the telescope for a child? Is the telescope for the whole family? What do you and the family want to do with the telescope? So you need to really evaluate where you live and whether you're going to just be using the telescope where you live or whether you plan to take it somewhere else. How much weight can you realistically lift and take out and put back together, and will it fit in the car, and what your goals are for use of the telescope, and finally, what's your budget? Because you can get very cheap telescopes, but they're probably not the highest quality, and you can get very, very expensive telescopes. So you need to figure out what your budget is, and once you know your budget, and once you've realistically answered the questions about usage and how much usage, and whether you're really going to use it and not end up like so many people who buy a telescope and it ends up in a closet, then we'll talk about how to get the best telescope that meets those answers that you give to those assessments. So first, let's talk about types of telescopes. Well, welcome back to the program. Now let's talk about types of telescopes. There are three types of telescopes: refractor telescopes, reflectors, or Newtonian reflectors, and catadioptric. This telescope is a refractor. It's kind of the classic look of what you think about when you think about telescopes, I think. And refractors are the same design as the telescope used by Galileo when he discovered the 4 moons orbiting around Jupiter that we now call the Galilean moons in his honor. Of course, we now know Jupiter has over 80 moons, but those Galilean moons are the ones you can see naked eye or with binoculars. And it's just a lens at the front that gathers the light and refracts or bends it down to the other end where you look through the eyepiece. Galileo's telescope was small, but also it had a lot of chromatic aberration or false color because it just had one lens at the front, and that causes the light to come to a point, but different wavelengths of light focus at different points. So that causes there to be some false color or chromatic aberration. And Newton said that Galileo's telescope would always have chromatic aberration, but he was wrong, because in the 1800s, a glass maker in Germany discovered that if you put a second piece of glass behind it, that you can eliminate most, if not all, of the chromatic aberration. So that's one big difference between Galileo's refractor and modern refractors. This one is a doublet, this one is a triplet, so it has 3 pieces of glass, and one of them is an ED, or extra low dispersion glass, and what that does is it disperses the light so that there's no chromatic aberration in this telescope whatsoever. And you can get doublets that have 2 pieces of glass, or triplets like this telescope, or even quadruplets that have 4 pieces of glass. The pros of a refractor telescope are that it gives you crisp, bright images. And if you have an apochromatic, which is like this, that has more than 1 piece of glass and it has no color, false color or chromatic aberration, it has inky black background and crisp, bright images. However, when you add that extra glass, some of them are exotic glasses or rare earth materials, they're expensive, and also it gets heavier. And also refractors in general, the bigger the aperture, which is the diameter of the primary lens, the heavier it is. So refractors can get heavier, they can get longer, very long if you have a big aperture, and they weigh quite a bit, and they cost way more per inch of aperture than other types of telescopes. So you get fantastic images with the refractor, especially an apochromatic refractor, but they're very expensive. And usually, I think refractors are sold OTA, which stands for optical tube assembly only. Sometimes they do not even come with these rings or the dovetail bar that allows you to attach it to a mount, because you have to attach it to a mount. So often if you buy a refractor, you only get the refractor. So if the price sounds great, you need to also factor in that you may have to buy rings, you may have to buy a dovetail bar, and you definitely will have to buy a mount to go with it. Now sometimes you can get a complete package where you get the refractor plus the mount. And in fact, Orion sells a refractor package called the Star View. It's a fantastic little starter kit for a kid. I would highly recommend it, because not only do you get the 90mm refractor, it comes with a finder scope like this, which you need to help you find things. It comes with an equatorial mount. It comes with a moon chart. It comes with 2 eyepieces and a star diagonal. And it's pretty well made. And I think it's an excellent choice if you have a child or a grandchild or a niece or nephew or somebody you know who's very interested in astronomy. I would highly recommend the Star Seeker from Orion. But you can just mix and match. You can buy the refractor and buy a mount. You can get an alt-az mount. Alt-az stands for altitude azimuth, and that is up and down and left and right. And well, you can get a cheap tripod and alt-az mount and put your refractor on that. You have to find everything yourself, and you're going to have to move it constantly to track objects in the sky. Or you can get an equatorial mount like this one that has a polar scope. Hopefully you get one with a polar scope and go straight through the middle, and that has to be pointed at the North Celestial Pole. And once you have that pointed at the North Celestial Pole, it can only be moved in, oh my gosh, I forgot to put the counterweights on. Be right back. So if you buy a refractor and you put it on an equatorial, or sometimes called German equatorial mount, you have to polar align it. And if it's not motorized, you have slow motion controls that will help you track objects in the sky. But you have to find everything yourself, you have to polar align. So you have to learn a bit about astronomy before you can get started. But you can get an equatorial mount that is computerized and go-to. And go-to means that you punch in what you want to see, the Pleiades, and it will go to that object if you have correctly polar aligned it. So a little bit more to learn with an equatorial mount, but definitely worth it, and it adds a lot to the experience. If you at least have one that tracks, you can get a basic equatorial mount that's just all manual, and you can add a tracker to it or a motor later if you want to. You can even add a computer to it later, or you can just buy computerized. But if you do that, you're adding quite a bit to the price of your setup, because you have to buy the refractor, maybe rings, maybe dovetail bar, star diagonal, and you want an eyepiece, at least 2, plus a finder scope to help you find things. And also, if you have a motorized mount, you need a battery to power it, unless you have your house and an extension cable or AC power you're going to use. You'll need a battery as well. So all those things add up. So you need to think about your budget and all of those things that go together to get a refractor. But they're fantastic telescopes, and they're very versatile, and also I think it's the telescope of choice for astrophotography. You can get a cheaper one, an achromatic, which will have a little bit of false color, but they can still be very good telescopes, especially for a beginner. I love refractors. Second kind of telescope is called a reflector, and it was invented by Sir Isaac Newton, and so sometimes they're called Newtonian reflectors. And they use mirrors, and the mirror is at the back of the telescope, and it gathers all the light in the mirror, and then it reflects it back to a secondary mirror that you see through the eyepiece, which is at the front of the telescope. Reflectors are a lot cheaper than refractors. They don't have any chromatic aberration like refractors do because they use a mirror. However, the mirror introduces a different problem called coma, which is, it looks like little half moons. You can correct for that, but it is a problem with reflectors. And also, I should have mentioned, refractors are maintenance free. You don't have to do anything but keep dust off of it, keep your lens clean. The second kind of telescope is a reflector, or Newtonian reflector. And although I own a Dobsonian, which is a type of reflector, I don't own a more classic type of reflector. So I thought I would contact my friend Grace, whom I gave my first telescope, a little Orion reflector, and ask her if I could borrow it. Siri, send a text message to Grace. Can I borrow your telescope? Ah, okay. On second thought, I think it's still in Tahoe. Let me check in my closet and get back to you. Tisk, tisk. Another telescope in a closet. Well, anyway, let's go get that reflector so we can talk about reflectors. Well, here it is, my original telescope, my first telescope, an Orion reflector on an equatorial mount. It's 114 millimeters. That's 4.5 inch aperture, 1,000 millimeter focal length, and f/8.8. It came with this wooden tripod, slow motion controls, 2 Kellner eyepieces, 25 millimeter and 10 millimeter, and it came with a planisphere. And you can still get this same telescope. They make it in white now. Orion sells the package. Comes with a little bit more. It's upgraded actually for $229.99. You can get a 4.5 inch reflector on an equatorial mount, EQ3, so metal, pretty sturdy. And it now comes with aluminum legs, and it comes with two Plössl eyepieces, 25 millimeters and 10 millimeters, which are better than Kellner a little bit. And I hope it has a better finder scope, because this one's pathetic. And it's good that I got this so I can show you some things to look for when you're looking for a telescope. You don't want a plastic finder scope. It should at least be, well, I use 9 by 50, but I don't know what this is, but it's plastic and it's probably no good. In fact, I think now they sell them with the red dot finder, which is easier to find things. This one has a plastic focuser, which is no good. You want a metal focuser, and you want it to not be wobbly. This one's wobbly because you screw it in and it doesn't have a saddle. So it should come with a saddle. You want a metal focuser, you want a better finder. Red dot finder's fine, but this thing's not very good. But other than that, you can get a pretty big aperture for not very much money. So $229 for a 4.5 inch aperture. You can't get anything close to that aperture in a refractor. So this is probably the best bargain for your money if you're on a tight budget. So like I mentioned, you do have to collimate reflectors. You have to line up the primary mirror, which is in the back, with the secondary mirror so you can get proper focus. And unfortunately my friend did not put the cover on, so I looked at the mirror and it's quite dusty. So this mirror needs to be cleaned, and you have to be really careful with that. And it needs to be collimated, I'm sure, since she had it in the closet. And you just do that by, you can get a piece to put in here and you adjust these screws on the back. But if you take care of it, they'll last forever. But those are the things to look for. Sturdy focuser, not plastic. You don't want one that has the wobblies like this one does. I don't know if you can see that. And should have slow motion controls if it's not computerized or motorized. Wooden tripod's okay, but you just want something sturdy. Really cheap in the reflector category is a type of reflector called a Dobsonian. It was invented by a monk in San Francisco named John Dobson, and he found a lot of mirrors from the old World War II ships that are around San Francisco after World War II. John Dobson would grind his own mirrors, and he would put them in cardboard tubes, and he would get on the sidewalk in San Francisco and try to get people interested in astronomy. I think he did more than any single person to get the public interested in astronomy, because Dobsonian telescopes are so cheap, and you can even make your own. And Chabot Space and Science Center has a class for grinding your own mirrors, and it's a very cheap way to get into the hobby. Dobsonians are the cheapest telescopes per inch of aperture that you can get. Now, they're on an alt-az base, and so you push it around. It just goes left and right and up and down, and you have to nudge it constantly to keep the object in the field of view, and you have to find everything yourself. But a basic, classic 6-inch Dobsonian is the biggest aperture you can get for the cheapest price, I think. Then the third type of telescope is the Catadioptric, and sometimes called Schmidt-Cassegrain or Maksutov-Cassegrain, and those telescopes use a combination of mirrors and lenses, and they're very compact because the light comes in and it hits the mirror, and then it's bounced back again before it comes out to the eyepiece. A lot of the Catadioptric telescopes are sold as packages. You get the telescope with a mount. Usually it's an alt-az mount or a fork mount. Celestron sells the very popular 6 and 8-inch Next SE telescope. It's a Schmidt-Cassegrain, and it comes with the mount and a computer. It's go-to, and it's very popular. I've never used one. I own a 12-inch Meade Schmidt-Cassegrain. It's a fantastic telescope. It's very expensive. It's go-to. You don't even polar line, you just make it level with the ground, point it towards north, and find a star, and then it goes to a database of, I think, 140,000 objects. And it's a fantastic telescope, but very pricey. But the 8-inch is more affordable, and it's in a complete package, so you don't have to buy a bunch of other things to go with it. It even comes with an eyepiece and a star diagonal. It runs off of C batteries, and that's an excellent choice. And there are other Schmidt-Cassegrains and some varieties called Maxitov Cassegrain and others that are on the same basic concept of using mirrors and lenses. And you can just buy the tube only and put it on your own mount. You can put it on a German equatorial mount if you want to, but then you have to keep in mind that if you just buy the optical tube, that you have to add in the price of the mount too to get your total cost to stay in your budget. And those are very versatile too, although for astrophotography they present some problems because if you're not on a German equatorial mount, you have to add a wedge, or you can use it for some shorter exposures, but you'll get some rotation of the object. But for visual, they're fantastic telescopes. So those are the types of telescopes, and those are some things to think about when buying a telescope. There are going to be some other costs associated with it. You're going to want more than one eyepiece, and you may want to add some other things that aren't necessary, but if you stay with the hobby and you use your telescope a lot, you might want to add filters. You might want to get some astrophotography equipment, so there are going to be other costs associated with it as you go along. And also, if you buy a certain telescope, you may grow out of it and want another telescope. But hopefully you buy one that's appropriate for you and your goals, and you stay with it, and it does not end up in a closet. So buying a telescope is very much a personal choice, depending on many factors that are personal to you, such as how much are you going to use it? Are you going to stay with the hobby? Do you have to travel with it? Does it need to be portable? Do you want something that you can use to get into astrophotography? And many of the things I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. But I can make some recommendations. If money is a concern and you only have $100, you can still get into the hobby. You can get a 76 millimeter refractor. The Celestron Star Sense is $119, and it's on an Altaz base. Orion makes the Star Blast, the Fun Scope, and the Space Probe. They're all $100. The Fun Scope and the Space Probe are reflectors that come on a tabletop mount. You put it on a picnic table or your car. There's also the Celestron 80 millimeter refractor, the Power Seeker. It's around $100 on an Altaz base. But if you can go a little more, you can get a much better, nicer telescope with better optics. And my recommendation for a beginner to get the biggest aperture for the lowest price would be to get a 6-inch Dobsonian. That's 150 millimeters of aperture. That's a big light bucket, and you can get one for $350, $400, and you're not going to get anything close to that aperture in a refractor or a Schmidt-Cassegrain. So that's my recommendation for a beginner telescope, a classic 6-inch Dobsonian. Orion makes one, Skywatcher, lots of other companies make them now. But if you're wanting to get into astrophotography, you probably want a refractor. And you can get some nice, very high quality refractors. William Optics makes the Zenithstar 81 millimeter. It's about $800. This 80 millimeter refractor behind me is about $900. That's the Orion ED80. It's carbon fiber. It only weighs 5.5 pounds. Skywatcher makes the EvoStar 100 millimeter refractor. That's about $1,000. And there are lots of companies that make small refractors that are apochromatic. They'll have excellent optics, and you'll get nice, crisp, sharp images, but you also have to buy a mount with those, which I mentioned before. So if you get a small refractor, you could use something like this iOptron GEM28. They claim it can hold 28 pounds, but you should not put anything over 10 to 12 pounds realistically. So it can hold an 80 or a 90 millimeter refractor, and that mount is now about $1,400. And then there's the HEQ5, which is identical to this Orion Sirius EQG that was discontinued, and the HEQ5 goes for about $1,400. Celestron makes the AVX. It goes for about $1,100, and they're all in a similar category. If you're just dying to have a USA made mount, there are some made here in the United States. There is the Losmandy, and their base model goes for $2,400, but it has a 50-pound payload. And then there are really expensive mounts, but if you're watching this video, you're probably not in the market for a very expensive mount, but USA made Astrophysics, those go for about $20,000, very high end. And then there are the Paramount mounts that are made in Colorado, I think, and those go for about $7,000. Other than that, they're mostly made in China these days. Skywatcher also makes the AZ EQ6, I think. That's an excellent mount, and I think it's $2,000, and it's very versatile because you can put it in AZ mode for observing, and then for astrophotos you can put it in the EQ mode, and that's a very nice mount as well. But there are lots of choices, but you'll need to have a mount and the refractor and star diagonal and eyepiece and a power source if it's computerized and motorized. So as far as refractors go, there are some very high-end refractors. The best in the world refractors are probably Takahashi, made in Japan, very expensive. Astrophysics, I think they're made in the United States. And then there is the Stellar View, made in Auburn, California. And these are made in the shop in Auburn, and they grind the glass and it's inspected, and this one is a doublet, and it was $2,400, I think, and there's also a waiting list for these telescopes. But if you want a US made telescope that's very high end, can't go wrong with Stellar View. And then if you don't have any concerns with money, well, the sky's the limit. Go out and get a Wisconsin made Obsession 30-inch. And finally, if you're only interested in astrophotography, you can get started with a star tracker. They're about $450, and the two main competitors are iOptron SkyGuider Pro and the Skywatcher Star Adventurer Pro. And they're both pretty comparable, and they can hold a DSLR or a mirrorless camera with up to a 600 millimeter lens attached, or you can even put a small refractor on it, but they do have a I think 10-pound weight limit, and they do track the sky, but you have to find everything yourself. So you do need to know a little bit about the sky to get started. You have to polar align it, and then you have to find everything. Of course, you could go out and buy an ASI Air that will plate solve for you. That means it will take a picture of the sky and figure out the star pattern and tell you where you are. And those are about $450, also a wait list for that. But with that, you're adding weight to your setup. So there's a limit to how much stuff you can put on those star trackers. But if you're only interested in astrophotography, that's a great way to get started in it. This is the popular iOptron SkyGuider Pro. It can be used with the ball head here, or if you have a heavier equipment, you can attach the declination bracket that comes with it, that also comes with a counterweight. This one has been modified with a beefier equatorial base made by William Optics, and it'll track the sky if you polar align it. This one does not have the eye polar. You can get it with an electronic polar scope, but to me that's a waste of time because it easily goes out of polar alignment. But you can get it with the polar scope, electronic eye polar. You use a laptop to polar align, or you can just look through the polar scope. Costs a lot more if you get the eye polar, but this is the popular iOptron Sky Guider Pro, and that's what I would recommend. So this is my setup. I use the Orion Sirius EQG computerized German equatorial mount. It's go-to. Unfortunately, they discontinued it, but you can get this identical mount in white from Skywatcher. It's called the HEQ5. It's a very capable mount, and I highly recommend it. And it can hold up to 30 pounds, up to maybe a 5-inch refractor. And I've got my friend Katie's Meade 6000 series 115 millimeter triplet. She let me borrow it for this video. I do own a 115 millimeter triplet. It's a Orion Eon, and it's a fantastic telescope, and so is this one. But unfortunately, Orion discontinued the good old Meade refractors. But I think 115 millimeters is a good size. You can see a lot with 4.5-inch aperture, but it's not too heavy, and it's easy to transport to places if you want to. And I use the Orion lithium-ion battery. It's very lightweight. It's 155 watt-hours, and it has AC power outlet and 3 DC power outlets and 3 USB. And so this is a nice setup. It's pretty portable. I can put it in my car and take it to places. But anyway, those are my recommendations, and I hope you found this helpful. And I hope you have access to dark skies, and that there will always be dark skies forever. Tsula signing off.